In this video, we're going to talk about setting up a new Fujifilm camera. Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we're going to be going over how I like to set up a new Fujifilm camera, and in this case that will be the GFX 100S because it's the new camera that I have. But as we know, Fujifilm's menus and the setup process is generally pretty common across cameras, so this should apply to any new Fujifilm camera that you buy. However, before we jump into that, I wanted to quickly talk about something that's very close to my heart. The country of Myanmar, where I've done a lot of my work for my Tattoos of Asia project, is currently in a bit of a crisis. The military has taken over again and refused to honor last year's election results. They've also imprisoned the lady, Aung San Suu Kyi, who was the elected leader. And things are not going well for the citizens, and they really need our support. And so, we don't necessarily have to be donating or going there and helping ourselves, but we can sign petitions or encourage our local government representatives to stand up for the rights of the people there and help out our fellow human beings. So I'll put a link down below to isupportmyanmar.com, which has a few different links that you can use in order to basically pledge your support to the people of Myanmar, and I hope that you guys can take a few moments out of your day and do what you can for the other humans of this planet. So let's jump into the video. Okay, so here it is, GFX 100S. I haven't opened the box yet, I just got home from the shop, so let's open it up and have a look together. I'm not going to do an unboxing, it's a bunch of manuals and a battery pack and stuff like that. So we're going to grab the camera out, get rid of all this stuff. Okay, and there it is. Okay, so as always, wrapped in plastic, and here we are, GFX 100. That's quite comfortable. I was not expecting that. The GFX 100 I found to be one of the most uncomfortable cameras I've ever held. The 50S was great, the 50R was good, aside from not having a grip, but that feels really good. So I've got a couple of charged batteries because I do use the XT4, which uses the same batteries. So let's drop one of those in. And the very first thing that I always like to do when I start with a Fujifilm camera is to, wow, they've got these little these little, what do you call them on here, the strap holders. Those will have to come off. I don't use straps that hold onto here, so those will come off, but they're quite noisy, so if you guys can hear that, I'm sorry about that. So the first thing that I like to do when I get a Fujifilm camera is to grab my phone and to pair with the phone. So quickly select language here, set to, yeah. The lack of a D-pad makes this difficult. There we go. We'll set to English. Okay, pairing with smartphone, yes. And the reason that I do this is twofold. The first reason is that it sets the time and date on the camera. And here we go. And the other reason, that's very quick with Bluetooth, the other reason that I do that is because Fujifilm cameras tend to have a couple of defects, what they call minor issues or minor bugs that always get fixed in a firmware. So the very first thing that this will do is to, let's set time, don't need location on there. Okay. Very first thing that I'll do is just check for firmware to make sure there's no updates on. This will allow me to do that without having to connect to the internet. And that just makes sure that there are none of these minor bugs. One of the big ones was, say, with the XT3, where it was having trouble writing files to the card and it was having lockup issues, and that was fixed within sort of 24 hours of getting the camera. So hopefully there won't be any issues with this, and it seems that there is no firmware update. So there we go. All right, next thing to do, and drop a couple of memory cards in. So I'll put one in each slot. And the reason that I do that is because I shoot all of my cameras on backup mode, just so I never ever lose any files when I'm working for a client. So when we get to that part of the setup, I'll set it to write the same files to both memory cards. All right, so let's switch these on. Okay, into the menu. Image quality settings. There's not a lot to change here, but I do shoot in RAW all the time. So the first thing I'll do is go into image quality and set RAW. And that just makes sure that, I'm not recording JPEGs, which is, for editing purposes, a little bit easier to work with. Okay, raw recording. I will always set this to lossless compressed. And what that does is just brings the file down to a smaller size without losing any detail or shadow detail or anything like that. As the name suggests, lossless. With this camera, you can choose 14 or 16-bit. Let's start in 16-bit. Next thing, film simulation. I like to work in classic Chrome. I don't usually use these for my final result, but when I'm looking through the viewfinder or when out working in the world, classic Chrome just sort of brings a little bit of the edge off all the colors in the world, especially when there's, you know, bright reds or bright yellows or something like that. It just brings them down a little bit and allows me to concentrate a bit more on the scene, the light, rather than, you know, looking at colors specifically, really, really bright colors. Okay, there's not much else to look at here. I typically leave my white balance on auto unless I'm going to be shooting flash or something like that, or I need consistency with files to deliver really quickly. Next menu is autofocus and manual focus. Now, I am going to set the AF mode by default to single point. It comes out of the box with the all mode selected, which allows you to roll one of the function dials. I'm not sure which one it is on this camera, just to be able to change between autofocus modes. But I typically only ever use 2 autofocus modes, so I'm just going to leave it in single point to begin with. AFC custom settings, won't need to customize those as we go. Pre-AF is off, that's good. One thing, the AF illuminator is off. Sometimes these cameras come out of the box with the AF illuminator turned on, and that just basically lights up if it can't find enough contrast to focus, and so you may end up blinding a portrait subject with a little light from the front of the camera or something like that, so I always have that turned off. The autofocus is good enough in these cameras these days anyway. Let's have a look. Down we go, down we go. Release and focus priority. That's another one that I will always do. AFS priority selection is already set to focus, which is great. AFC priority is set to release. And what that will do is try to keep up the frame rate. So if you're on, say, continuous high, and you're shooting 5 frames a second, I believe this camera will do, 3 or 4 or 5, something like that. Basically, it will try to hit that frame rate regardless of whether it's focused on the subject or not. So you might get a lot of missed frames. I will typically set that to focus, because I would much rather have 3 in-focus frames than a couple of out of focus and a couple of in-focus frames. So I'll always have that set to focus priority. And nothing else on there that needs to be, touchscreen mode, off. I am not a fan of touchscreens, so that will be turned off. Okay, the next menu is the shooting settings. Most of this will stay as it is until we actually get out into shooting, and specific situations call for things like a self-timer. Let's go down there, just make sure there's nothing that I have missed. Shutter type is on electronic front curtain. Now, that's fine if you're not shooting really, really fast lenses, like, let's say, the 110mm f2 that I love. So I'm going to set that to mechanical shutter, just so that I never have any issues with, the changes in the bokeh that you might see or things like that. So I very rarely use electronic front curtain. Here, IS mode, this has in-body stabilization now, so that's set to continuous, which is fine for me for now. That just basically means that while you're looking through the viewfinder as well, it will be steady. So if you have it set to shooting only, it will only stabilize after you actually release the shutter, and you might still get that jittery looking viewfinder. So I always have it set to continuous. Perhaps it uses a little more battery, but it allows me to compose with something like the 110mm and just have nice, stable frame while I'm composing. Okay, flash settings, nothing to be changed in there. And now here we go into where the real setup of the camera happens, which is in the actual setup menu. Now in here, we'll go into user settings first. I'm just going to format both of these cards. Always do that with a new camera, just to make sure that, no writing errors happen because of cards that are sort of mismatched with the body or something like that. So format both cards. There we are. Takes a little while. Okay. Now, date and time is already set. Time difference we don't need to worry about until I start going abroad, and then I might set it for where I'm going. Everything else here, sensor cleaning, battery age, all of those things are just fine. Next thing, sound setup. Finally, a camera where the AF beep is turned off when you get it out of the box. One of the things that I've absolutely despised about the X series cameras is when you take them out of the box by default, the AF beep is on, and so every time you half press and it focuses on something, you hear this audible dip, and absolutely despise it because I do a lot of, corporate events and things like that, and all that does is just draw attention. So glad to see that it's off in this one. Operation volume is also off. The shutter volume is on, which is interesting. I do not need a fake shutter sound, so we'll turn that off. Okay, there we are. That is pretty much it. Next one's our screen settings. EVF brightness is set to auto. Usually works quite well, but we'll see after a bit of use. If I do find that I'm missing exposures because I'm not able to judge them with the automatic brightness levels in the EVF, then I might change that to a manual setting. But for the most part, auto seems to work quite well. EVF color and EVF color adjustment, again, we'll see how the EVF is before I start adjusting things like that. Image display is off, which is good. I don't need to see every photo that I shoot. Every time I shoot one, I don't need it popping up in the viewfinder or anything for me. That's fine. Preview exposure and white balance in manual mode is set to preview right now, which is perfect. I will assign this to a function button later, which will allow me to switch it on and off when I'm working on, say, flash shoot, where I might go from using flash to not. I can very quickly switch that on and off. Natural live view, don't need that. Let's go down. That looks pretty good. Okay, display custom settings. This is where we'll find something pretty interesting here. I like to have the framing guidelines on. I like to have the electronic level on, which just allows me to make sure that the camera is level for things like the horizon. And focus frames, yep, those are good. The histogram I also like to have on, just useful when you're doing manual exposures and you have a little bit more time to examine. It'll just show you whether you've got any blown highlights or any really, really dark shadows. That's quite useful. And nothing else that we need to change in here, I don't believe. Most things are on. Perfect. Okay, so back out of that. Now, ooh, this one actually has the quick menu background. You can, like with the X-T4 or the X100V, you can actually have a gray background for the quick menu, the Q menu, or you can have that overlay onto the basically what the camera is seeing. So it's currently set to transparent, which is overlay, which is great. Button and dial settings. Here's the next one. So the focus lever setting is on, which is good. That just allows you to move the focus points with the actual little lever on the back here, which feels a little bit interesting. It's not quite as definite as the one on, say, the X-T4 or the X100V, but we'll see how that goes over using. Okay, edit and save the quick menu. This may change over time because I'm not sure about the custom function buttons on this, seeing as we don't have the D-pad on the back. But for now, I'm going to set it to 8 slots, which is what I've done with my X100V, which also doesn't have the D-pad on the back. So 8 slots will basically allow me to have 8 tiles in the Q menu instead of having the 16, which is the default. And I never use 16 different functions in my quick menu, so this is a really welcome change to the new bodies for me. So 8 slots. It seems the top left one cannot be changed. I wonder what that is. Okay. So I'm going to go through and set these up, and I will let you know what functions I assign to them in a moment. Okay, so I've got my quick menu set up the way that I think I will use it. This could change over time and take a little bit of refining. But yeah, so the top left tile, which you can't customize, is actually the PASM setting, which is interesting because that's already up here. So I hope that in a future firmware update we'll be able to swap that tile out for something else, as it's not really something that I'm likely to use from the quick menu. The other functions that I put in there are the AF modes. So as I said before, I'll typically use 2 of those, and one of them is single point, and the other one is the zone mode. And so I'll be able to very quickly switch that from my Q menu. Now, with something that has a D-pad like the X-T4, the X-T3, that's actually assigned to one of my rear function buttons, so that's going to take a little bit of getting used to, but I've also assigned that in my X100V as well, so hopefully the transition won't be too difficult. I have put the film simulations in here. Occasionally I do like to, switch to black and white and see the world in black and white, or I'll have a job where we might be doing 2 different types of color, and I'll just get more of an idea for the scene by using something like Classic Chrome and Velvio or something like that. I've also got my white balance in there, which, from time to time you do need to change, and it's better not to go through a menu for that. And the next two things that I've got in there are my image quality and image size setting. Now, the reason for that is I like to often use, 3x2 or 65x24. In fact, I've got an entire video on why I love 65x24 panoramic mode in these cameras, and I'll link to that above. But the reason that I like to have them here is because in order to switch those modes, those previews of the aspect ratio, you actually need to switch into RAW plus JPEG or a JPEG mode. Fujifilm doesn't allow you to preview the different aspect ratios without having a JPEG recorded as well, which again is something that I hope they will update in firmware and just allow us to preview that and have it saved as a flag in the RAW file without having to waste card space on JPEGs. The other two things that I have, the other thing that I have in here is the shutter type. So occasionally, if I'm locked down on a tripod and I'm not using any flash or anything like that, I will use the electronic shutter in these cameras. And so I actually have that in there as well. And the other tile is free for now. We'll see what I might use. Maybe I'll put some flash function settings or something in there as well. But for now, it is free. So the next is the function button settings. And it looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4 function buttons. And then, yep, there's some touchscreen functions, which I won't be using anyway. So this, just like with the XH1 or the GFX 50S, I believe, and probably the 100 as well, has this button here that you can use for exposure compensation. So I'll leave that as exposure compensation. The next button, which is this one here, is currently set to face detect. I'll leave it at that. The next one here is set to the sub monitor, so I'm guessing you can change the different modes of that. That could be useful, but I think more likely for me is actually having the full 3D accelerometer enabled so that you're able to get basically level the camera and also level it this way. So two different axes of leveling. So I will go through and find the electronic level setting. Now, basically that's a little bit different from the one that you have always enabled. The one that's always enabled is just a horizontal one, whereas the one that you can bring up by pushing the function button actually has this tilt as well. So that's quite useful. This function button just next to the lens here is currently set to performance, which we'll get to in a moment, but I'm never going to change that. So let's have a quick look at what we can set that to. Smooth skin effect? I don't think so. Actually, you know what? Let's set that to ISO. That will allow me to quickly change my ISO. Seems like a good thing to have. Although that may be because we have two dials on this, maybe something that I don't need to change. So let's have a look. We'll come back to that one. Okay, back into the menu. Command dial setting. We're about to find out. Okay, so the front one is currently set to ISO, and the rear one is set to shutter speed. So ISO, shutter speed, that could work. Okay, we'll leave that as is for now. Shutter AF and shutter auto exposure, I leave those on. I don't back button focus, so I will leave the autofocus and auto exposure on the front button here. That's just fine for me. Shoot without lens. I am going to turn that on. What that does basically is allows you to take third-party lenses, ones without body communication, like say the Minacon 65mm f1.4, the Laowa 17mm f4, or any number of lens adapters, and it allows the camera to basically take photos when it doesn't think a lens is attached. And with those, because there's no communication electronically, it doesn't know that there's a lens attached. So that setting trips a lot of people up. I recommend turning it on. There's no detriment to leaving it on, so I just leave it on. Shoot without card, we're going to turn that off because, well, I don't want to shoot photos when I don't have an ability to record them, okay? So we'll leave that one. Down here, I don't think there's too many. Let's go into that touchscreen setting and we'll turn that off. We do not need that. I'm sure there are people out there that love touchscreens, but I mean, I despise them, so I'm not going to be using it on my cameras. All right. Save data setup. This is the other one that I really want to make sure that I have set up. So frame number is going to be set to continuous. Basically, if you set it to renew, that means every time you put a memory card in or format a memory card, it will reset the numbering system. That can be a bit of a pain if you copy multiple shoots into one folder, because files will have the same names and you'll end up overwriting them. So I just leave that on continuous, and it will basically go through, I believe it goes through 10,000 images before it resets the counter that way. And then it will amend a number to the bottom or something like that. And basically you don't get the same file name ever again. So that's good. Edit file name, I'll do that later. Typically, I will set the file name to the name of the camera. So if I'm using my X-T4, that will be X-T4. If I'm using my X100V, it will be X100V, or X10V, I believe, because you can only put 4 numbers or 4 characters in there. So I just have that so that I know, even by looking at a file, which camera it was shot with. And also for that same reason as I mentioned before, if you put files into the same folder from a different camera, there is a chance that they will have the same file name if you stick with the default naming convention. And so basically that means you have to rename some files every now and again if names overlap. So I just give them separate names to make sure that it never becomes an issue. Okay. Card slot setting. Now this one, you have options for sequential, backup, or RAW and JPEG. Basically sequential will fill one memory card and then move on to the next. Backup will write the same file to both cards, and RAW plus JPEG will write RAW files to one card and JPEG files to the other. I use backup for this because I do a lot of work where I'm working with, say, an adoptive family, or even just a couple, or at a corporate event or something. These sorts of events that really cannot be got back. So moments that I really can't afford to not have saved on a memory card, so I have them all set to backup just to make sure I keep those files. And that's it. There we go. Copyright info, always put your name in. It's just one extra little step. Connection settings, nothing to change in there. So there we have it. That is a Fujifilm camera set up. Now, I hope that that was kind of interesting for you. If you have any questions about, other things that I've set up in there, or if you'd like to go into a little bit more detail about why I choose the settings, or maybe if I've missed a setting that maybe you would want to set up, do let me know. I'd be happy to go through those for you. As we do have the GFX 100S here, and I will be starting to use it over the next few days, I would also encourage you guys to throw any questions that you might have about the camera in the comments below. And I'll get back to you with, my findings in the next video. So thanks for watching today. And again, as I mentioned, I support Myanmar.com. Please show a little support for our fellow human beings and help them get back on the track to becoming a nation that is ruled by the rule of law. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.